I've been trapped in a nursing home for 5 hours and everyone's dying. By Altruistic Print 5264. The 5 stages of grief are just like the 5 stages of the apocalypse. Grandma's voice made me anxious. I've been sitting at the foot of her bed, looking out into the storm that feels like it's been going on forever. As I turned to look at her, she was staring at me with a blank stare. "What are you talking about, Grandma?" "I feel as if the end of the world is coming soon, my child, soon," she replied. I looked back at her and smiled. She doesn't speak much due to her dementia getting the best of her. She thinks I'm her daughter, and it's the 1990s, which is before I was even born. She smiled a crooked smile before saying, "That's what I was saying about the 5 stages. Denial is first." Grandma has never talked about anything morbid like this. She normally talks about her childhood and early adulthood before she had my mum. She normally repeats the same stories about how she met Grandpa in high school and how they fell in love. It's been years since I've heard her talk about anything in the current time. So, if the world was really ending, I was going to humour her with some questions. "Okay, Grandma, how is the world going to end?" She looked around the room frantically to make sure nobody was around to hear what she was about to say. "They get in your head. They've been trying for years and years," she said. I replied with, "Who, Grandma?" "You have never heard of them, my child. They are more interested in the old and tired like me." At this point I was starting to get a little anxious, but I kept asking questions because not only was I anxious, but I was curious. "So, Grandma, you said that we have had denial. What are the other stages?" She speaks softly but firmly. "Anger and bargaining." She pointed to the window and said, "If you look through the storm, you'll see it. It's moving quickly." I decided to look out the window. This time I saw one of the nurses pushing a wheelchair to a different building under an umbrella. I recognized the woman, and it was Mrs. Lansing from a couple of rooms down. Mrs. Lansing turns her head and faces the nurse and says something, but he doesn't react, so I guess he didn't hear her. The nurse stops and leans down to get her to repeat herself, but she just stares and doesn't say anything. I saw his lips start to move, but when they stopped, she reached her hand around one side of his neck and stabbed him with a needle in the other side. As the nurse thrashes on the wet ground, Mrs. Lansing gets out of her wheelchair and jumps on top of him and starts drinking the blood that is rushing out of the wound she caused in his neck. I could hear his screams through the window before they grew weak and stopped. At this point, I slowly backed away from the window, and I hear Grandma laughing lowly behind me. She says in between chuckles, "The thing that people don't realize about the apocalypse is that it isn't all that what is described in the Bible like everyone thinks." I walked to the door and began to open it when I realized there were sounds of people rushing around outside. I heard doors slamming open and closed and nurses yelling for the residents to go back into their rooms. I heard one of the male nurses yell for help. Then I heard a thud followed by a sucking sound that made me weak at the knees. I backed away from the door and locked it, not knowing if it would keep anyone or anything out. I then ran back to the window and made sure it was locked and closed the curtains. My grandma then says, "You're a part of this now, my child." I looked at her and responded, "In what, Grandma?" "The fourth stage. It's not going to be much longer now." That happened about 5 hours ago. It's dark outside now. I'm still sitting at the foot of Grandma's bed and I'm starting to get hungry. I can still hear the cries for help from the nurses that are left. Their cries make me anxious that I'm never going to make it out of here alive. I can occasionally hear the steps of people walking up and down the halls. I looked back out the window and I could see the nurse's lifeless body lying in the same spot with no sign of Mrs. Lansing. She was there the second time I looked out, but that was a long time ago, and now she is gone. I heard noises outside again, 30 minutes after my last look. This time Mrs. Lansing and 10 other residents were gathered around his lifeless body. The rain and thunder had picked up now, so it's getting a bit harder to see. They were eating the nurse. I was in shock when all of a sudden Mrs. Lansing looked up, and I think she saw me, but I'm not sure because I quickly shut the curtains. Me and Grandma are sitting here in the dark. Ever since Mrs. Lansing looked up, I turned the lights off. After I turned the lights off, Grandma fell asleep for a little while. Once Grandma woke up, she started mumbling something, and every time she repeated it, she got louder until I heard her loud and clear. She was saying, "The final stage is acceptance." I just want to thank Altruistic Print 5264 for allowing me to narrate this story. If you enjoyed the story, please head over to their Reddit page and give them some love. If you're new here, please like and subscribe, and stay tuned for one more nightmare.